Charles Marvin's mornings always began the same way. At 75 years old, he liked the comfort of routine. His modest home sat on the quiet edge of Mill Creek, a small southern town where everyone knew everyone, or so they claimed. Charles would tend to his garden in the early hours, the smell of fresh soil grounding him, before heading down the tree-lined road to the church. He wasn't just a visitor there, he was a singer in the choir, a voice that had carried through decades, though few people truly listen these days. On this particular afternoon, Charles finished his walk from the church after a rehearsal. His cane tapped rhythmically against the sidewalk as he made his way home, his worn hat tipped slightly to shield his eyes from the sun. He'd passed the same corner 1,000 times, but today, a group of teenagers loitered near the gas station, their laughter cutting through the stillness. "Hey, old man," one of them called out. Charles stopped briefly, his instincts telling him to keep walking, but something about the boy's tone froze him in place. The leader of the group, a wiry teen named Tyler, smirked as he approached. His oversized sneakers scuffed against the pavement. "You got $1 for me?" Tyler asked, feigning politeness but unable to mask the mockery in his voice. Charles straightened his back, his voice calm. "Sorry, son. Don't carry much cash on me." Tyler grinned, flashing a row of crooked teeth. "Oh, come on. I know you got something. How about you sing for it? Heard old folks like you can belt out some tunes." The group snickered behind Tyler, their laughter sharp as glass. Charles hesitated. There was something in their eyes, a kind of recklessness that wasn't worth challenging. He turned to leave, but Tyler stepped closer, blocking his path. "Come on, Grandpa. Just a song. I'll give you $1. You like dollars, don't you?" Charles felt his chest tighten. He glanced around, but the street was empty. The gas station clerk was inside, too busy to notice what was happening. The teenagers began chanting, their voices growing louder, egging him on. Tyler pulled a crumpled dollar bill from his pocket, waving it like bait. "Sing, old man," one of the boys shouted. "Sing for your supper." The humiliation hit Charles like a wave, washing over him in an instant. His instinct was to push past them, to walk away, but his knees felt heavy, and the shame rooted him to the spot. He hadn't been called out like this in years, not since the days when segregation signs hung in storefronts and police officers turned a blind eye to cruelty. Reluctantly, Charles opened his mouth. His voice trembled as he sang the first few notes of an old gospel hymn, one his mother used to hum while cooking dinner. The teenagers erupted in laughter, their phones raised to capture the scene. Tyler tossed the dollar onto the ground at Charles's feet, sneering as he stepped back. "There you go," Tyler said. "Guess that's what dignity costs these days." Charles bent slowly to pick up the bill, his hands shaking. He didn't need the money, but he needed the ordeal to end. As he straightened, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the gas station window. The man staring back at him looked small, broken, and far older than his 75 years. The boys sauntered off, their laughter echoing down the street. Charles stood there for a moment, clutching the crumpled dollar. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on him now, people who hadn't been there when it mattered but who now gawked at the aftermath. He wanted to disappear. When Charles finally made it home, he sat in his favorite chair by the window, the dollar bill still clutched in his hand. He turned it over and over, as if trying to make sense of how such a small thing could hold so much weight. The humiliation replayed in his mind like a song stuck on loop. Every laugh, every jeer, every click of a phone camera was etched into his memory. Later that evening, his granddaughter Lisa arrived for their usual Sunday dinner. She was a vibrant 24-year-old, full of life and determination, with a sharp wit that Charles admired. She immediately noticed something was off. "Grandpa," she said, placing her bag on the table. "You okay? You look tired." Charles forced a smile. "Just a long day, sweetheart." Lisa wasn't convinced. She glanced at the dollar bill on the table and the distant look in his eyes. "What happened?" At first, Charles hesitated to tell her. He didn't want to burden her with his troubles, didn't want her to see him as weak. But Lisa was persistent, and eventually, the story spilled out. Her face shifted from concern to anger as he spoke, her hands balling into fists. "They did what?" she said, her voice rising. "Who were they? Did you call the police?" Charles shook his head. "What good would it do? They're just kids. It's not worth the trouble." "Not worth it?" Lisa's voice cracked with frustration. "Grandpa, they humiliated you. They need to be held accountable." Charles sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Lisa, I've lived long enough to know that fighting back doesn't always fix things. Sometimes it just makes the hurt worse." But Lisa wasn't ready to let it go. That night, as Charles went to bed, she scrolled through social media, determined to find evidence of what had happened. It didn't take long. The video was everywhere, on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. The caption read, "Grandpa sings for $1." The comments were a mix of laughter and outrage, but the damage was done. Charles Marvin was now the face of a viral humiliation. Lisa's hands trembled as she closed the app. She wasn't just angry for her grandfather, she was angry for what the video represented, for the casual cruelty that seemed to permeate the world. She vowed, right then and there, that she would do something about it. The chapter ends with Lisa staring at her phone, determination etched across her face, while Charles lies awake in the next room, haunted by the echoes of his song. Charles woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone vibrating endlessly on the kitchen counter. He groaned as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his joints aching from age and the emotional toll of the previous day. He shuffled into the kitchen and saw the name flashing on his phone, Pastor Helen. For a moment, Charles considered ignoring it, but he knew Helen well enough to understand she wouldn't stop calling until he picked up. "Good morning, Pastor," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Charles," Helen's voice was calm but tinged with worry. "Have you seen the video?" Charles's heart sank. Of course. She knew. Everyone probably knew. "I've heard about it," he muttered. "Lisa showed me last night." Helen paused for a moment, her silence louder than her words. "Charles, I know this isn't easy, but I want you to come by the church today. Let's talk." "I don't think so," Charles replied quietly. "I'm staying home." "Charles," Helen said gently but firmly, "you can't let this define you. You've faced bigger storms than this." Charles didn't respond, and Helen didn't press further. Instead, she told him she was praying for him and hung up, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, Lisa was in her tiny apartment, pacing back and forth as her laptop screen glowed on the table. She had spent hours combing through social media, following every share and comment trail of the video. It was worse than she imagined. People from all over the country had seen the video, and the comments were a mix of heartless jokes and a few scattered voices of outrage. One comment stuck out to her: "This is what happens when you give them too much freedom." Lisa slammed her laptop shut. Her hands shook with fury as tears pricked her eyes. "This isn't right," she muttered under her breath. She opened her phone and began drafting a post. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her thoughts raw but precise. She wrote about her grandfather's life, his dignity, his resilience, and what he had endured, not just yesterday but over a lifetime. She ended the post with a call to action, urging people to share the story for the right reasons, to stand up against the kind of cruelty that allowed something like this to happen. When she hit post, her chest tightened with anxiety. She didn't know if anyone would care, but she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. By midday, Lisa's post had started to gain traction. Friends from college shared it, adding their own supportive comments. Activists began to take notice, tagging larger accounts and drawing attention to the story. But not all responses were positive. Some dismissed it as overreaction, while others dug into Charles's life, questioning his character without knowing a thing about him. One person wrote, "Maybe he deserved it. People like him always begging for handouts." Lisa nearly threw her phone across the room when she read it. The level of cruelty shocked her, but she also knew this was exactly why she couldn't stop now. Back at home, Charles tried to tune out the world. He sat in his chair by the window, staring at the crumpled dollar bill still sitting on the table. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of all the moments in his life when he had been made to feel small. Memories of his youth began to surface, memories he had long tried to bury. He thought of the diner he used to pass as a teenager, the one with the whites only sign plastered across the window. He thought of the summer he spent marching for civil rights, his voice blending with dozens of others as they sang for freedom, for dignity, for a future where something like this wouldn't happen. And yet, here he was, decades later, being humiliated on a public street for the amusement of children. Charles closed his eyes and sighed deeply. He had fought so hard for his dignity once. Was it worth fighting for it again? Later that afternoon, Lisa showed up at Charles's house unannounced. She carried her laptop and a fire in her eyes that Charles hadn't seen before. "Grandpa," she began, sitting across from him, "I know you don't want to talk about this, but we need to do something." "What good will it do?" Charles asked, his voice flat. "What's done is done." Lisa shook her head. "No, it's not. People are listening. They're sharing your story. You can't let them reduce you to a joke, Grandpa. You're so much more than what they saw in that video." Charles looked at her skeptically. "And what do you think I should do, Lisa? Go out there and shout at people? That's not who I am." "I'm not asking you to shout," Lisa said softly. "I'm asking you to speak. To tell your story. If they're going to talk about you, let them hear the truth." Charles fell silent. Lisa's words lingered in the air, heavy but compelling. He wanted to dismiss her, to tell her that it wasn't worth the effort, but something inside him stirred. The memories of his past, of the battles he had fought and the songs he had sung, wouldn't let him rest. That evening, as Lisa left to return to her apartment, Charles sat alone in the quiet of his living room. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, his own words echoing in his mind, "What's done is done." But was it? As the sun set, Charles made his way to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. Tucked between old photo albums and church hymnals was a leather-bound journal he hadn't touched in years. He opened it carefully, flipping through the pages of songs and prayers he had written in his youth. His fingers stopped on one page, the words of an old gospel hymn staring back at him. He hummed the first few notes under his breath, his voice hesitant but steady. The sound filled the room, small but resolute. For the first time since the incident, Charles felt a flicker of strength return to him. The chapter ends with Charles closing the journal and whispering to himself, "Maybe it's time they heard my voice again." The next morning, Charles woke to a knock at his door. For a moment, he thought he'd dreamed it, but when the knocking grew louder, he reluctantly pulled himself out of bed and shuffled to the door. Pastor Helen stood on his porch, her kind eyes peering at him through the screen. "Good morning, Charles," she greeted warmly, holding a thermos and a small brown paper bag. "I brought coffee and some biscuits. Thought you might like some company." Charles sighed but pushed the door open. "Come on in, Helen. You're persistent, I'll give you that." Helen stepped inside, setting the bag and thermos on the kitchen table. She looked around the room, noting the journal left open on the armrest of his favorite chair and the dollar bill still sitting on the table. "I see you've been doing some thinking," she said, motioning toward the journal. Charles lowered himself into a chair with a groan. "Thinking, maybe. Acting, not so much." Helen poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Charles. She sat across from him, her expression soft but determined. "Charles, I know this is hard. But people are talking. Lisa's post, it's reaching a lot of folks. They're asking questions, wanting to know more about you. They see what happened, and they're angry. But anger without purpose can turn into something dangerous. Your voice, your story, could give that purpose." Charles shook his head, staring into his coffee. "I don't know, Helen. I'm tired. I've fought my battles. I don't know if I've got it in me to fight another." Helen reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "You don't have to fight alone. You've got a whole community behind you now. And Charles, you've always been a man of faith. You know as well as I do that sometimes, God puts us in places we don't want to be so we can do the work we were meant to do. Charles didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, letting Helen's words sink in. After a long moment, he finally nodded, more to himself than to her. Later that day, Charles decided to leave the house for the first time since the incident. He made his way to the church, where a small group of community members had gathered to discuss upcoming events. Lisa had mentioned the meeting earlier, though he hadn't told her he was planning to attend. When Charles stepped into the church hall, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, and for a moment, he felt the weight of their stares. But then Pastor Helen stepped forward, her smile wide and welcoming. "Charles," she said, her voice warm. "I'm so glad you're here." Lisa, who had been seated near the back, jumped up and rushed to her grandfather's side. "Grandpa, you came." Charles nodded, his grip tightening on his cane. "I figured it was time I stopped hiding." The room relaxed, the murmurs of conversation resuming as Lisa guided Charles to a seat near the front. As the meeting began, Charles listened quietly, absorbing the discussions about community outreach and events to address issues of racial injustice and social inequality. When Pastor Helen mentioned a larger town hall event planned for the following week, all eyes turned to Charles. "Mr. Marvin," Helen said gently, "we were hoping you might consider speaking at the event. Your story, it's powerful. People need to hear it." Charles hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. The thought of standing in front of a crowd, reliving what had happened, made his stomach churn. But then he looked at Lisa, her eyes wide with hope, and something shifted in him. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice steady but cautious. Over the next few days, Charles found himself thinking more and more about the town hall. He spent hours flipping through his journal, revisiting the songs and prayers he had written over the years. He hummed old hymns to himself as he worked in his garden, the familiar melodies stirring something deep within him. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, Evan appeared at the bottom of his driveway. The young man looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Charles watched him approach, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Marvin," Evan began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what happened?" Charles didn't respond immediately. He studied Evan's face, searching for sincerity. The boy looked uncomfortable but earnest, his shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of his guilt. "I was stupid," Evan continued. "I didn't stop it when I should have. I didn't think about how it would hurt you. And I don't want you to think we're all like that. I'm not like that." Charles nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. "It takes courage to apologize, son. But words alone don't mean much. What matters is what you do from here on out." Evan swallowed hard, nodding. "I want to do better. I promise." For the first time, Charles offered a small smile. "Then show me." As the day of the town hall approached, Charles decided he was ready. He spent hours practicing what he wanted to say, his voice growing stronger with each rehearsal. Lisa helped him prepare, sitting with him on the porch and listening intently as he spoke. "Grandpa," she said one evening, "you don't just have a story. You have a voice that people need to hear. Don't hold back." Charles nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense that his voice truly mattered. The chapter ends with Charles standing in front of his mirror on the night before the event. He adjusts his tie, his reflection staring back at him with a quiet strength. In the background, an old gospel hymn plays softly, the lyrics a reminder of the battles he's fought and the ones still ahead. "Tomorrow," he whispers to himself, "they'll hear me." The church was packed the next evening, its pews filled with people from all corners of the town. The town hall had drawn an unexpected crowd, not just regular churchgoers, but local activists, curious onlookers, and even reporters. Word about Charles Marvin's story had spread far beyond Mill Creek, thanks in part to Lisa's efforts on social media. Lisa sat near the front, her hands gripping the edge of the pew. She glanced at her grandfather, seated on the side of the stage, looking calm yet contemplative. He wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to her graduation, and though his shoulders carried the weight of years, there was an undeniable dignity in his posture. Pastor Helen stepped up to the pulpit to open the evening. Her voice rang out clearly, commanding attention. "We are here tonight," she began, "not just to discuss the incident that brought us together, but to confront the deeper issues that allowed it to happen. This is not just about one man. It's about all of us, about how we choose to treat one another, and how we can move forward as a community." She turned toward Charles and extended her hand, a warm smile on her face. "And now, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Charles Marvin, a man whose voice we are all privileged to hear tonight." Applause filled the room as Charles rose slowly from his chair. He gripped his cane tightly, the sound of his footsteps echoing as he approached the pulpit. For a brief moment, he stood there in silence, scanning the faces before him. The applause faded into an expectant hush. Charles cleared his throat and began to speak. "Good evening," he said, his voice low but steady. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles Marvin. I've lived in this town for most of my 75 years. I've seen it grow. I've seen it change. And I've seen it stay the same in ways that hurt more than I can put into words." He paused, his eyes settling on Lisa for a moment. Her gaze gave him the courage to continue. "Some of you might know what happened to me last week. Maybe you saw the video. Maybe you laughed at it. Or maybe it made you angry. Either way, it's out there now, and I can't change that. What I can do is tell you my story, so you understand the man in that video." Charles straightened his back, his voice gaining strength. "What you saw in that video wasn't just a moment of humiliation. For me, it was a reminder of all the times I've been made to feel small. It took me back to my youth, to the days when I wasn't allowed to walk into certain stores, or drink from certain fountains, or sit in certain seats. It took me back to the marches I joined, the songs we sang, and the fists I clenched as people shouted words I wouldn't repeat here tonight." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "I sang for them," Charles continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Not because I wanted to. Not because I needed that dollar. But because I thought, just maybe, it would make them leave me alone. In that moment, I wasn't Charles Marvin. I wasn't a man. I was entertainment. And that's what hurt the most." He took a deep breath, his grip on the pulpit tightening. "But here's the thing, they didn't take my dignity from me. They didn't take my voice. And they didn't take my story. Because my story is bigger than that one moment. It's a story of resilience. Of faith. Of hope." Charles turned to the audience, his eyes scanning the room. "We talk about change like it's something that happens to other people. Like it's someone else's responsibility. But change starts right here, right now, with each and every one of us. We can't keep turning a blind eye to the things we don't want to deal with. We can't keep pretending that casual cruelty is harmless." He paused, his voice softening. "I know some of you in this room think I should have stayed quiet. That I should have let it go. But silence never changed anything. Silence never made a difference. That's why I'm here tonight. To remind you that we all have a voice. And it's up to us to use it." As Charles finished speaking, a quiet murmur rippled through the audience. People shifted in their seats, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions, guilt, hope, admiration. The silence stretched on until, slowly, one person began to clap. Then another. And another. Soon, the church was filled with the sound of applause, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes as she joined in the applause, her heart swelling with pride. Charles stepped back from the pulpit, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just shared. For the first time in days, he felt light, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. As the applause died down, Evan stood up from the back of the room. The young man's face was pale, his hands trembling as he made his way to the front. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he approached Charles, his head bowed. Mr. Marvin," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness. But I need to say I'm sorry. For what I did. For what I didn't do. I want to do better. I will do better." Charles studied Evan's face, the sincerity in his eyes. After a long moment, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son," he said gently, "it's not about deserving forgiveness. It's about earning the chance to be better. You've taken the first step." Evan nodded, tears streaming down his face. The moment between them was quiet but profound, a ripple of redemption that seemed to echo through the room. The chapter ends with Charles stepping away from the pulpit, his head held high as the congregation begins to disperse. Lisa joins him, slipping her arm through his as they walk toward the church doors. The crowd parts to let them through, their faces a mix of respect and admiration. "Grandpa," Lisa said softly, "you did it." Charles smiled, his voice steady. "No, sweetheart. We did." The morning after the town hall felt different. The air in Mill Creek seemed lighter, as if something unspoken had shifted. Charles woke to sunlight streaming through his window, a sense of calm washing over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The weight he had carried, the shame, the anger, the doubt, was no longer crushing him. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He picked it up, expecting a message from Lisa, but instead, it was a notification from social media. Lisa had tagged him in a post, and curiosity got the better of him. Her post from the night before had gone viral. Again. This time, though, it wasn't a video of humiliation. It was a clip from his speech at the town hall, paired with her heartfelt words. "My grandfather's voice was silenced once, but last night, the world heard it again. This is who he is, a man of dignity, strength, and hope. Let's make sure no one else has to sing for their dignity ever again." Charles scrolled through the comments, his eyes widening as he read the responses. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, of messages, some from strangers, others from people he hadn't seen in years. "Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Marvin. You've inspired me to stand up for what's right." This man's courage brought tears to my eyes. "We need more people like him in the world. Mr. Marvin, you're a hero." He set the phone down, his heart swelling. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, but for the first time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right. Lisa arrived at his house later that morning, her face beaming with excitement. She carried a stack of papers and her ever-present laptop bag. "Grandpa," she called as she stepped through the door. "Did you see the post? People are talking about you everywhere." Charles chuckled as he sat down at the table. "I saw it. Never thought I'd be famous at 75. Lisa grinned. "It's not about fame, Grandpa. It's about impact. Your story is making people think, making them care. That's bigger than any viral video." She spread the papers across the table. "I've been getting emails all morning. Activist groups, schools, even a few journalists, they all want to talk to you. Some want you to come speak. Others want to feature your story in articles or videos." Charles blinked, feeling slightly overwhelmed. "That's a lot." "I know," Lisa said gently. "And I'll help you with all of it. But I think this is your moment, Grandpa. Your voice is more powerful than ever." Over the next few weeks, Charles began to step into his new role. Lisa worked tirelessly to organize speaking engagements and handle media requests, all while ensuring her grandfather didn't feel overwhelmed. Together, they traveled to nearby towns and cities, where Charles shared his story with students, community groups, and church congregations. At one school, Charles stood in front of a group of high schoolers, his hands resting on the lectern. Many of them looked like the boys who had humiliated him, young, full of bravado, yet uncertain of their place in the world. He told them about his life, his struggles, and the choices he had made to rise above hatred and cruelty. "Your voice," he said, looking out at the sea of young faces, "is one of the most powerful tools you have. Don't waste it on tearing others down. Use it to build something better. By the end of his talk, the students were on their feet, applauding. A few even came up afterward to thank him personally, their eyes wide with admiration. Evan had kept his promise to do better. After the town hall, he joined a local mentorship program at Pastor Helen's suggestion, working with younger kids to teach them about kindness and respect. Charles took him under his wing, inviting him to help in the garden and sharing lessons about life, faith, and responsibility. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, Evan hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Marvin," he began, "do you think I'll ever make up for what I did?" Charles paused, leaning on his cane. "Making up for it isn't the point, son. What matters is what you do moving forward. Every choice you make is a chance to be better than the person you were yesterday." Evan nodded, the words sinking in. He glanced at Charles, his respect for the older man evident in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a second chance." Lisa's online campaign, The Voice Within, gained momentum quickly. It started as a small initiative to raise awareness about the kind of casual cruelty that had led to her grandfather's humiliation, but it soon grew into something much larger. Schools began adopting anti-bullying programs inspired by her work, and community leaders reached out to partner with her. One evening, as Lisa sat with Charles on the porch, she showed him the latest updates on her laptop. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a news article featuring their story. "They're calling you a symbol of resilience, Grandpa." Charles shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm no symbol. I'm just a man who finally decided to stop being quiet." Lisa reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're more than that, Grandpa. You're proof that one voice can change everything." Months passed, and the town of Mill Creek began to feel different. The incident that had once brought shame and division had now sparked a movement toward unity and understanding. Events were held to celebrate diversity and promote kindness. Conversations that had once been avoided were now happening openly. And at the heart of it all was Charles Marvin. On a bright Sunday morning, Charles returned to the church where it had all begun. The choir was preparing to sing, and the sanctuary buzzed with quiet anticipation. As Charles took his place among the singers, Pastor Helen nodded to him from the pulpit, her eyes full of pride. When the music began, Charles closed his eyes and let the familiar notes wash over him. His voice rose above the others, steady and rich, carrying the weight of his story and the hope of what was yet to come. As the hymn ended, the congregation erupted into applause, their admiration for Charles evident in their smiles and tears. He stepped down from the choir stand and joined Lisa near the front pew. "Grandpa," she said, her voice soft, "how do you feel?" Charles smiled, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had come to mean so much to him. "I feel," he said, "like they finally heard me."